The Boise State Public Radio app. News, music, and more.
Idaho Matters.
Morning Edition.
All things considered.
The Connector.
And more.
And more.
You can take us wherever you go and stay connected. Without it, you're missing out. Download it free.
You can also communicate using the Talk to Us tab.
The Boise State Public Radio app.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Jim Gaudet. It's Idaho Matters. History has been shaped by many, from activists to scientists to politicians. However, not all who have contributed have been recognized, particularly those who are women. Which is why Dr. Diana Carlin will be hosting a series of lectures at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute to look at women, the forgotten men in history. The lectures start on March 31st, and Dr. Carlin, who's a professor emerita of communication at St. Louis University, joins us now. Hi, how are you today?
I am just fine, enjoying spring.
Spring it is. Spring has sprung, definitely. Okay, let's jump in. Tell us about some of these women whose achievements you'll be looking at. You have quite a diverse bunch.
Yeah, this course is called Women, the Forgotten Men in History. And I didn't come up with that. Somebody said that about women and the lack of women in our history books. I put this together for an Osher class at the University of Kansas several years ago, and it was very popular. And so the Northwestern and the consortium that Boise is involved in picked it up. And I had run across various women, from biographies, from other kind of research I was doing. So what I've done, it's a 7-week course, and each class is 75 minutes, and I will talk for about 60, although people can interrupt me, and then leave about 15 for discussion. And I don't let anyone know who the women are.
Ooh.
But I have categories. So like the first 2 weeks are women, I say women in war and peace. And so I have some spies in there, not Mata Hari, everybody's heard of her, but some spies. I have women who pretended to be men so that they could fight in the Revolutionary and Civil War. Some interesting women that way. And women who won Nobel Peace Prizes, who once again are little known unless you know a lot about the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. And then I look at women in aviation. We all know about Amelia Earhart, but there were several other pioneering women who have not gotten the credit and have done some pretty amazing things. Science, there is a famous poet, British poet, whose daughter, actually in the 19th century, came up with what eventually became a computer language that was used when we started computers. Hard to believe, 100 years before. And you don't hear much about her in the history of computer science. So I really wanted to do a variety of women in STEM, women who were social activists. I talk about a suffrage leader who literally was written out of the women's suffrage movement history by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even though they'd been good friends.
Wow.
And so it's a real interesting combination. It was fun to do. There are probably 200 women I could have included.
Why do women get left out? You mentioned at least one of them who was sort of edged out by others in the movement for women's voting rights. But why is there less ink in our history books for some of these women?
Well, for the most part, history has been written by men. If you stop and think about women's access to education, it certainly lagged behind men. And even, men didn't have great access to higher education or to the ability to write about history. So the few elite men who did wrote about elite men. If you stop and think about our history books, it was mainly about the great men with only a few women scattered in there. So, women have been left out because it was men who were primarily writing the history books. And that, makes perfect sense. And this whole notion of the great leaders, the great military leaders, the great, heads of state were the ones who really made a difference. But we know that there were even men who were left out of history who were doing things, and we're beginning to learn more about them. But it's a matter of who writes the history. The Hamilton musical, which I love, it's who was in the room and who's going to tell the story. And the story has typically been told by men, so they have concentrated on men.
And so now we get a chance to share the accomplishments of these lesser known names.
Right. The course starts the last day of Women's History Month. And so, we couldn't get it in earlier, so we could have covered, 4 weeks of it as Women's History Month, but it's at least starting at the end of Women's History Month. And I think we shouldn't just have a month devoted to women's history. They should be scattered throughout all of it. And if you notice behind me, there are a lot of books on First Ladies. And last fall, one of my friends who also studies First Ladies, Dr. Myra Guten, we taught a course for this same Northwestern Consortium on First Ladies history, and they also have been ignored. Some of the time they did some things that made their husbands president. They were responsible for their husbands becoming president. But once again, if you tell how much those women did, then you begin diminishing the president. So they've been left out for a lot of reasons too.
Well, and let's talk about that. I mean, you've been studying First Ladies for more than 30 years. How'd you get started doing that?
Well, I became interested in First Ladies in elementary school. My small parochial school had a great little library, and there was one shelf that was all biographies of women. So given how old I am, you stop and think about that. That was pretty remarkable. But then the nuns who taught me were also women, and they were going to make sure women's history was there. And so I read every one of those, and there was Abigail Adams was one of them, and I just became fascinated with Abigail and kind of studied her where I could. There wasn't much on her, but I found what I could. And then when I was at the University of Kansas, before I went to St. Louis University, in the Communication Studies department, I taught a course on women in politics, and it looked at the entire history of how women have become involved in politics, mainly in the US. And it occurred to me that the first women politicians were the wives of these founders, and especially Abigail Adams, who was very much involved in her husband's administration. And so that got me started looking further at First Ladies. And about the time I started teaching that class in the early 90s, there was beginning to be an interest in First Ladies, and there were some books that were starting to come out. So that was really what sparked it. Abigail was my muse. And I had the good fortune with my two co-authors on a book we wrote about the history of First Ladies to be at the Adams Presidential Center earlier in March for their Women's History Month program, and to talk about Abigail at length and her daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams, who was also First Lady. So that was kind of how it all started, with looking at women in politics.
I'm curious, since you've done so much study on First Ladies, has the position of First Lady changed over the years?
It has and it hasn't. Martha Washington sort of set the stage, and she had to create this whole cloth. And George was smart enough to know that he couldn't be both the head of government and the head of state by himself. So he needed Martha to help with the head of state duties, the diplomacy piece, the receptions that they had, so that anyone could come and meet the president and first lady if you were dressed appropriately, to mingle with the diplomats at dinners, and that he needed her by his side to do that soft diplomacy. And our first ladies still do that. In fact, our second ladies do it. Mrs. Vance is going to Greenland with her husband in the soft diplomacy role. And so we've had the wives of our presidents and vice presidents, at their side helping with that soft piece. So that goes from Martha all the way to the present. And even issues they cared about. Martha committed her own money to supporting veterans and widows. And we saw that with, especially with Mrs. Obama and Dr. Biden, were very big on joining forces and supporting military and their families. So that's been a thread, but it's also changed in that women now have the right to vote. Women hold political office for the last 100 years. And so our first ladies take on issues now. They go to Congress and give briefings, and that would never have been done when the country was founded. So that's really probably one of the biggest changes, plus giving speeches, being out there, being covered by the press. That has really changed over time.
And I know that we're kind of veering off your talk a little bit with First Ladies, but do you have a favorite First Lady? I'm curious.
Yeah, I've been asked that. My co-authors and I are asked that all the time, and I kind of glibly said at a conference a couple of years ago, whoever I was writing about at the time was my favorite first lady. But it's hard to overlook first ladies such as Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she just rewrote the whole thing, but it was timing, and it was the perfect time. Lady Bird Johnson kind of changed the modern first lady. Betty Ford was phenomenal. I have just tremendous respect for her. Pat Nixon. I was just on a program at the Nixon Library a couple of weeks ago for their spring symposium, and people have no idea everything Pat Nixon did because she just wasn't getting the press because the men in the West Wing didn't want her to. So there's another example of why women haven't been there. They've been suppressed. And one of the women I'm going to talk about in my course on the Forgotten Men was a woman who basically had her research stolen by a couple men and they got the attention. And that has happened where, when women have been involved, they've been put in the background. If you think about the book and then the movie Hidden Figures, there was a good example, and it was wonderful when that book came out. Also, the Netflix movie about the African American women who were handling all the mail in Europe. That story has just now been told, and that was a pretty amazing story. So, there are a lot of interesting stories out there that still need to be told.
Wow. Okay, so what are you hoping that folks who come to a series of lectures, Women, the Forgotten Men in History, what are you hoping they take away from it?
Well, I hope they have a greater appreciation for, what women have done historically, not just in this country, but I look at women from a lot of other countries and the role they've played and begin to understand why we have such things as Women's History Month. That it's a chance to then put a spotlight and get people interested. I will have a bibliography because there are some books that have been written. They usually are not bestsellers. You have to kind of dig to find some of them, but there are some biographies of some of these women, and there'll be a bibliography, and hopefully they'll go read some of them because some of them just are fascinating. One of them I just couldn't put down. And in fact, she was at a special exhibit on the Middle East at the Nixon Library when I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I will be showing a picture of her actual journal that I got to see there, which is pretty exciting. So I'm hoping that it sparks an interest and that they do some extra reading, even if they go and Google them and find out some additional things that I maybe haven't talked about given the time limitations, and just really come to appreciate how many people have contributed to our history and to what we have today, because some of these were real pioneers and we are beneficiaries of what these women have done.
Well, I really appreciate the conversation. It's been great fun.
It has been. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to promote my course.
All right. Thank you very much. We've been speaking to Dr. Diana Carlin. She's a professor emerita of communication at St. Louis University. And she'll be teaching a course called Women, the Forgotten Men in History. Coming up, March 31st is the first day. It's a series of lectures at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise.
I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.